Hey guys, happy Easter. So today I'd like to show you how to watercolor and alcohol marker real chicken eggs that we've blown. So this tutorial has multiple parts. I'm going to show you how to blow and clean eggs. I'm going to show you how to watercolor on eggs. We're going to attempt to do Suminagashi or water marbling using a traditional Suminagashi kit on eggs, and I'll show you how to use alcohol marker on eggs. Finally, we'll talk about whether or not all of this is even worth it anyway. So I hope you guys will enjoy this tutorial. I did create some beautiful eggs, and I look forward to showing you guys some tips and some tricks for how to draw some beautiful spring florals on your own Easter eggs. So grab your eggs, grab your chickens, grab your paints, and let's get going.
Let's start with our watercolor eggs. All eggs were washed with dish soap before blowing and washed with dish soap after, and then all eggs were wiped down with vinegar before painting. The materials I'm using to paint these eggs are the Meiliang watercolor pigments. So these are also known as the Pretty Excellent watercolors. Basically, they are a student grade watercolor with a lot of pigment and some opacity. I figured they would stand out pretty well on these eggs. I haven't tried using professional grade watercolors, but honestly, gouache would probably work beautifully on these. So I have these shot glasses that my landlady left in the house, and they're a little bit too big to work well, but I did find that washi tape rolls or like Scotch tape rolls will work really well to hold your eggs. And believe me, you want something to hold your eggs because these little dudes are round and they will try to get away from you. So I'm gonna pre-activate my watercolors with just a spritz of water. This means all of the colors are gonna be available to me as I'm painting. And I also went with a palette that has a lot of pre-mixed colors. Gansai watercolors might work well for this as well. So I wanna start out by showing you guys some basic flower shapes. We're gonna start with a tulip. This is a very simple 3-petal design with a 4th petal going down underneath. As I was painting my eggs, I was using Google Images as reference for color, for petal shape. If you're not super confident with painting flowers, the 3-petal tulip is a very easy, very satisfying way to paint some spring flowers that's not overly difficult. Next, we have a violet. This is a 5-petal flower, and I'm really using my brush to do the majority of the work here. You also want to leave a fair amount of white space in your flowers, and you want to do a lot of water control. You want to work with your paints as thickly as possible. Thin glazes are not really going to work well on the eggs because the eggs don't absorb any water, so the water just evaporates out into the atmosphere, which means that if there are drips, if there are runs, if there are puddles of water, they are very likely to just roll off your egg and leave a lot of dripping. So for these wild roses, we have a 5-petal design, and I'm mostly just kind of smooshing my brush around in a circle. If you're familiar with Chinese watercolor at all, those kind of techniques are going to work really well for painting eggs. In fact, using sumi on eggs might make for some interesting and beautiful designs. I apologize that the dandelion is kind of hard to see, but we've got like 6 or 7 little short brush strokes at the crown, the center of our dandelion, and then we radiate the brush strokes around the dandelion, leaving lots of white space. And that way you guys can actually see the individual flower petals. So in general, painting flowers, you don't want to do large flowers. You guys will see me try to do a poppy, and it was just unsuccessful because it was too big on the egg, it was too wet, too much water, and it dripped a lot. So forget-me-nots are little 4-petaled flowers, very similar to the wild roses, radiating from the center, and I'm mostly using the side of the brush to do most of the work. And then finally, we're going to do some irises. So we start with a really thin petal design. We kind of expand it out towards the edges, and then we add a little loop coming from it. And Bowie is nagging me to remind you guys that if you enjoy tutorials like this one, if you find it helpful, useful, and informative, tutorials like this one are hugely time consuming to record. There's so much work and so much prep involved that if you enjoy these kind of tutorials, please consider supporting them and the creation of them on Patreon. And you can find me at patreon.com/natosoup. I share most of my tutorials over there now exclusively, and all of my art supply reviews are shared there early access. So now that we have the flower bases painted, it's time to paint some stems. Well, actually, I'm going to do a secondary layer of color on some of these. So like with some of the tulips, if you want to add extra color, I really recommend you go with a darker, more saturated color. So on a yellow tulip, you do orange. On an orange tulip, you do red. On a red tulip, you do a red violet. And then for the stems and leaves, I really recommend keeping it as simple as possible and really working to utilize the best aspects of your brushes. So using decent watercolor brushes, ideally watercolor rounds that come to a nice point, that's going to be really helpful when painting flowers on your eggs. So for violets, you can do a curved stem and then a heart-shaped leaf and just fill that in. Something else to keep in mind is after you finish watercoloring it, you can go over it with gouache or white gouache to add in details. And you really want to practice good water control when you're painting flowers or painting anything on your eggs. Again, the eggs do not absorb water. So I'm adding little yellow dots to the centers of my roses. Wet into wet techniques might look charming in tutorials, but they're very challenging to do on real life, real eggs. They might be easier on ceramic or wooden eggs, something that can better absorb your watercolor. But on real eggs, you're very likely to just get a lot of drips, a lot of running, and colors lifting back up. So my recommendation for watercolor eggs is work simply, work saturated, leave lots of white islands. It's like you're painting stencils almost. So roses typically have like 3 petals. The petals are kind of like strawberries in that you get 3 leaves. Sorry, leaves, not petals. You get 3 leaves on each stem. But for these roses, I'm just painting a couple of leaves peeking out from behind the roses. So on the dandelion, I'm using a yellow-orange just to add some shadow and some definition. Again, you don't want to cover the entire flower with it. You want to really just kind of leave it sporadic and leave it for shadow. And I highly recommend you let your first layer dry completely before adding on your next layer. It's going to prevent dripping, and it's going to be much easier to get those layers and much easier to do water control. So for the stem, I'm painting kind of this dark green collar. Those are the sepals coming off the dandelion. For the forget-me-not, I'm just adding a little yellow dot in the center because they usually have kind of white centers. And I'm going to do these like trefoil leaves where they're like 3 lobed leaves. So very simple. If you've got some good flower abstractions, those will work really well for watercolor eggs. I believe Tila Cunningham on YouTube does some very simple how to draw flower tutorials that would work really well for this kind of project. For the irises, I'm adding 3 little lobes of yellow to the center. Then I'm going to add a wider stem, and it's going to get narrow as it kind of exits the iris. And then the leaves are these long, narrow, blade-like leaves. So these are techniques you might want to practice on paper first, get good at it, and then attempt to paint it on leaves, because I cannot express enough that painting something nice on an egg is surprisingly difficult. I think a lot of the tutorials I was able to find online oversimplified painting on eggs. It can be done. It can be a satisfying experience, but it's really not at all like painting on watercolor paper, and you really need to adjust your expectations. And I do think lifting some techniques from Chinese watercolor is the best way to go about creating beautiful watercolor eggs, especially if you've never done it before. So here are our finished designs. We're going to be using these a lot when painting eggs. You can also combine them to create a garden scene or to create a wreath. So we're going to start with some tulips, and I want to point out that it takes a while for the watercolor to dry, so I'm starting several different flowers at the same time. Basically, I'm putting in a base layer. I try to absorb the excess water using a thirsty brush or a paper towel, and then I let it dry and I move on to another egg. And you guys can really see how the washi tape just helps you hold it in place. These are so small, they're so finicky. It is pretty difficult to do. To me, this is a one and done kind of craft. You do it one time, you say, okay, I've done it, and then you don't do it again. So this is when I was still kind of learning my basic egg painting technique. I was doing some wet into wet, but I was working fairly small. If you want to paint all around the egg or you want to cover the entire surface of the egg, I recommend you work in batches. You do one face, let it dry fully, then turn it. This is going to not only help prevent you from smearing the watercolor on the egg with your fingers, because you do need to handle it somehow. It is also going to prevent as many drips, which we're about to see. So now I'm painting some of the wild roses. I'm keeping it loose and pretty simple. You do want to go back in and absorb that extra water, and I'm attempting some wet into wet with the yellow, and you guys can see it basically just bleeds out to the edge of the flower. If you want those kind of bleeds, that's one thing, but if you're looking for a very mannered, controlled watercolor situation, this is not really going to be it. This is a very loose watercolor situation. Now, maybe people are applying some sort of watercolor ground to their eggs, but I have these beautiful local green eggs that I wanted to preserve. So, you know, I'm not going to apply a watercolor ground to this, but there might be something that they're doing to make the eggs a bit more receptive to watercolor. I also want to say recording this, getting a good view for y'all and painting this makes it more challenging. So if you're painting at home and you have no intention of recording, it's going to be a little bit easier to handle. So you can see I tried to wipe it off. It basically stains and smears. So other than absorbing water, I'm not really trying to do anything to control the drips. They're going to happen, and an egg isn't going to absorb the watercolor. It's best if you just accept that those drips are there and try to move on. And this is definitely challenging. I'm not even trying to get a fully watercolor effect. I'm just creating the impressions of flowers. And some flowers are a lot easier than others. So here we have a dandelion design. And I didn't leave as much space between the brush strokes as I probably should have. And there's a lot of drips there. So that's something you want to absorb with your paper towel before it drips all over the place. And it is very challenging to handle these little bitty eggs. Eggs are small, they're kind of smooth, and you want to touch them as little as possible. We wipe these down with white vinegar. I actually have how to blow and clean eggs as a separate tutorial. So I am definitely going to link that in the cards for you guys. I hope you will check it out. I think I hit on some pretty good techniques, but we wiped them down with vinegar to remove any excess grease or dirt or any kind of resist that might be on the eggs. And my hands were clean when I started this project, but I still ended up with areas of resist on these eggs. These eggs also take a while to dry. Even though I'm in Southeast Louisiana, I was painting on a fairly not humid, not muggy night, had the AC on, and I had the dehumidifier running. And they still take a while to dry, and they have a tendency to drip if you don't do any water control. I think the green eggs turned out better than the brown ones. You guys will see me painting a couple brown eggs here, but gouache might really pop out on brown eggs. So if you've got some gouache, I recommend picking up some brown eggs and giving it a try. The gouache would also probably look really good on these green eggs as well. I just don't happen to have gouache, otherwise I probably would have tried it. You can also use acrylics, you can use Posca markers. You're certainly not limited to just watercolor for this. And later on in the video, we're going to attempt to do Suminagashi, i.e. water marbling, and we're also going to do alcohol marker on eggs. But maybe far later in the future, I may try Posca on eggs as well. I do recommend painting smaller flowers. You get more dripping, you have more issues with water control and with the water just moving all over the place when you're painting larger flowers. I guess because compared to the surface of the egg, which is fairly round, the flowers are just too big and there's just not enough quote unquote flat surface compared to the size of the egg. So you guys can see I'm kind of picking up eggs I'd already started again and going back in and adding details. This isn't a great like step-by-step how to do each flower tutorial. That's why we started with the flowers in the beginning to kind of show you guys, because these do take such a while to dry. And to be frank, I know a lot of like the twee cute mom blogs show watercolor eggs and like, oh, we're gonna have an Easter egg hunt and we're gonna give these to our friends, and it's very sweet and it's very precious, but it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. This is a very time-consuming project. These are prone to reactivating and smearing a bit if you get them wet, so you don't exactly want to hide them, and they're very fragile. You might decide to give them to friends. You might decide to use them as placeholders at a dinner or something, or use them as maybe like wedding favors, but they're just a little bit too time-consuming and precious to just hide in an Easter egg hunt. So here's one you can really see me struggle with. I tried to do a large, loose poppy. Poppies are not necessarily difficult to paint, especially in a looser style, but I was working way too big on too small an egg. So you should try to do a little at a time, because you're gonna need space to handle the eggs. You don't wanna put your finger in wet drips. You don't want to put your finger on wet flowers. So you do need room to handle the eggs. Maybe there's a better method, like maybe you could wrap a paper towel around your hand and that would help. It would not make for good YouTube, but it would certainly make the process a little bit easier. And I did about a dozen plus 2 eggs. I did a dozen green eggs, and I did, I think, 2, maybe 3 brown eggs, just to try it out. And this took several hours to do. And at the time, I was actually a little bit frustrated because it is so difficult not to drop these eggs. For the white eggs that I'm gonna work with later with alcohol markers, I'm using large white eggs, but because I purchased the green eggs from a local farmer's market, they were just the size they happened to be. So since water control is such a struggle with these, I think using watercolor markers might be a good solution and something definitely worth investigating, maybe in another video. Or even alcohol markers, which we do use later on, so stay tuned. I'll show you guys how to do this. So something else is, be careful. My sleeve caught one of the eggs and knocked it off the table. These things are so light. That's one of the reasons they're so difficult to deal with, is they're very prone to just toppling over. They're prone to just rolling off the desk. I have a washi roll for each of these eggs just to hold these eggs steady while I'm working on them and give them a place to dry. I really, really recommend working with like tape rolls or washi rolls or maybe paper towel rolls, just something to hold your eggs while you're doing them. So that little tulip egg there is the one that broke, and it broke later on. And I have to tell you guys, it is a huge shame to spend all this effort blowing and cleaning and drying and cleaning again and painting the eggs for it just to break. So maybe if you have like an egg carton you can store them in immediately after, you should do that. What I ended up doing is I ended up cleaning out my 18 count styrofoam egg container with dish soap and water, and I allowed it to dry, and I'm going to use that to store my eggs, at least for the time being. So you guys see these large petals on the poppy, just so prone to dripping. I did finish the poppy, but it's ugly. I kept it to show you guys that not everything I do turns out great. I'm not proud of everything I do. And when you're doing something new, there's going to be a learning curve where you kind of struggle with it and where you're kind of learning how to do things and you're figuring yourself out. So as I mentioned earlier, if you want to do darker colors, if you want to do layers, I recommend waiting until the first layer is kind of dry. So this one is kind of a neat one. This is a flower garden egg. So we're starting with a wild rose design, and I'm basically painting 5 little hearts in a circle and smearing them just a little bit. I'm painting little hearts in a circle to represent the roses. So I'm going to do this one step by step, a little bit at a time, starting with the roses. And this is when you take the most simplified brush strokes for each flower and paint them in miniature. So as I mentioned earlier, I am heavily referencing these flowers and their leaves as I paint, but you can use totally made up abstracted flower forms for this if you want. You totally do not have to paint realistic flowers. In fact, you don't have to paint flowers. Joseph suggested I paint a Pikachu on one of these eggs. I said absolutely not. I am not painting anything more complicated than flowers, but you can. If you draw a lot of Pokemon, do some cute Pokemon eggs. It does not have to be Easter related. It doesn't have to be spring related. If you want to do this, you can do whatever you want on your eggs. But I will say, there's no good reason to use real eggs for this, really, unless you've just got like a favorite chicken or you happen to have like a cool duck egg or something, because there are so many good fakes out there that are less likely to break, not as light, so they're going to be a little easier to handle, larger, and are more receptive to watercolor or other painting techniques. So now that the little roses have mostly dried, I'm going in and I'm doing some tiny little 5-petaled violets, and I'm just kind of sprinkling them in among the roses that I've painted. I also want to point out, this is really difficult to do if you have hand tremors, which I do, especially at the end of a day. So if you do have hand tremors, maybe a looser technique, something like splattering watercolor might work well, or intentionally dripping watercolor onto these, or doing the tulips are a very simple design, because as my hand was shaking, it was becoming harder to pull lines, harder to hold the egg steady, harder not to just randomly drop the eggs, which was particularly frustrating. So this is definitely a more challenging watercolor craft that does require more fine motor skills than typical watercolor, I would say. And obviously, recording it and having my camera right in the middle of things does not make things any easier. I'm working around the camera. So I recommend, if you opt to do this, do it off camera. It's so much easier to move around. For me, the bigger pieces are the hardest pieces because they just drip all over. And layering is so hit or miss. Sometimes you can layer, and I would recommend you can layer darker mostly. So as we talked about earlier when we were talking about how to draw the different flowers, try to layer darker. You're going to get a better effect. So in my little garden egg, I'm adding in some tulip designs using a very simple 3-petaled tulip. And this is one that's going to require a lot of waiting because there's a lot of water on that egg. So again, with layering, sometimes it just reactivates the prior layers and everything sloughs off. Simple is really the best for this kind of thing. Chinese watercolor would work well for this because it's basically 1 or 2 brush strokes and you're finished. You don't want to overwork these, and you really can't do a lot of correction or blending, or at least I wasn't able to do so. Maybe if we were working on a larger egg and we had more surface area, we could do that. So you guys can see I'm just kind of working my way around the egg, letting it dry, doing it in bits and pieces. This is the result that I have found works the best. Another thing, you can probably draw on the eggs using graphite, using color pencils, using watercolor pencils, using like fine liners. Basically anything that will stick to and dry on the egg, you can probably apply to the egg. But as I mentioned earlier, there's so many good egg duplicates out there that aren't gonna shatter if you drop them, that yes, it can be done on an egg, but really, should it be done on an egg? So here are my tips for doing watercolor on eggs. Work with lighter colored eggs unless you're using gouache. If you have brown eggs, white gouache looks really nice against the darker brown. Keep your flower designs very simple. Focus more on brush strokes to create form rather than relying on layers. You might get 2 layers like with the tulips if you're lucky. Be patient. Work in an area, let it dry, and then pick it up again. The paint doesn't soak into the egg itself, so in general, work thick. Thickly mix your paint. Don't use a whole lot of water. Student grade watercolors are actually great for painting eggs. Handle your eggs as little as possible. If it drips or smears, as seen on this poppy here, dab up the wet paint just so it doesn't drip further and then move on. You won't be able to correct it and it'll look worse for trying. Just accept the drips. Tape rolls, like for Scotch or washi tape, do a nice job holding the eggs, and believe me, you need something to hold the eggs. Some eggs are just not going to turn out well, like my poppy. That's okay. Look how many nice ones we ended up with. Leave white or blank space for you to handle the egg. If you want a pattern all around the egg, like this mini flower garden pattern here, do it in batches and be very patient. Otherwise, I mostly focused on one face of the egg, and that was enough. These are sort of fun, sort of weird, and a lot of work. I would almost rather ceramic or wood. I would do this again if someone else blew and cleaned the eggs, or if I'd prepared eggs for someone, I'd be fine with preparing the eggs for them. But doing all of it and then painting them, it's just kind of pointless, you know? You have a pretty egg. Maybe if you have a favorite chicken or your chicken legs are particularly pretty egg, I could see that. But to just do this, it's definitely a lot. And although this project was often gross, sometimes annoying, and occasionally frustrating, I had fun and I'm glad I did it. Except now I have to do something with all these eggs, and I'm definitely afraid of applying a spray lacquer for fear that it's going to reactivate them. Before we get too far in, I also want to let you guys know I have transcription notes in the description below. It's not full show notes, it's not a full tutorial, but I do have transcription notes down in the description if you've missed out on something. I'll also link the materials I've used if you want to buy stuff to do this, though to be real, I don't really recommend going out and buying stuff to do this project. Let me know in the comments which of the watercolor eggs is your favorite egg. Which egg is the best egg? I also want to point out, it is way easier to do this on paper than on eggs, but they do use similar techniques. And I'm just gonna keep on working on my watercolor eggs. But next up, we're gonna attempt to do Suminagashi, or water marbling, on eggs. So I decided to do the iris design kind of at the end of the video. I had one egg that Joseph had attempted to drill a hole in way back when we were first learning how to blow eggs. And I wasn't going to use it at all, but I was like, you know what? I'm going to try out a new design. And I decided to do irises because I do love irises. I think they're a beautiful harbinger of spring. You can see me using a little wadded up dab of paper towel just to soak up some of the excess water before it drips. And you can see I'm keeping the iris design really simple but iconic. Basically, think in silhouettes. It's going to be a great way to achieve attractive and not overly difficult, overly rendered flowers. Seriously, no joke. I've seen some flowers, some eggs on the internet with watercolor illustrations on them that are just so well done. I think they're probably using watercolor pencils rather than using straight up watercolor, because the amount of detail that some artists are able to achieve with these eggs, I just don't know how. I just don't know how. You're so patient. Maybe you're not painting a dozen. That was my problem. I was painting 14 eggs in one sitting, and that was probably too many eggs. If I'd sat down and really focused on just one egg, it might have turned out better, but instead I decided to do a whole baker's dozen plus one. But you know, this is really more realistic to what most people watching this tutorial are going to want to do. You're going to want to do probably several eggs. Maybe you're like me and you've convinced yourself that you might give them away, or you might hang them on an egg tree, or you might display them in a festive Easter display. But y'all, we are not Martha Stewart. We are not getting paid to do all of this with eggs. So I mentioned white gouache earlier, and I do think gouache, because it's a thicker, more opaque watercolor, it really works well for painting on eggs, particularly on the brown eggs where that white gouache just really pops off. So if you want to paint on eggs, gouache, acrylics might be the way to go. And then also with the acrylic-based color, once it's dried, you don't actually have to worry about it smearing or getting all over the place. You're also probably thinking, Becca, you sure are complaining a lot for a project you decided to do. Isn't that how it goes? I call it aspirational crafting. You see these beautiful images on other people's blogs, on their YouTube channels, on Pinterest, on Instagram. Maybe there's not a whole lot of information about their process. They just say, oh, it was really easy to do, or I had so much fun doing it, or fun crafts to try at home. And you think to yourself, I could do that. I could totally do that. I could definitely paint on eggs. Maybe you think, I'll be like Beatrix Potter and paint on eggs. That's such a beautiful cottage craft thing to do. What a relaxing spring activity during COVID. Maybe you kid yourself. Maybe you fooled yourself. That's definitely what happened to me. This just seemed like it would be so much more fun than it actually ended up being. And I think one of the big killer points for me is all the effort that goes into this. If I just worked with hard-boiled eggs, that would have been one thing. But blowing and cleaning and polishing with vinegar adds a couple of extra days of work that just doesn't make this worthwhile, especially when there are some great faux egg alternatives available, like wooden eggs, ceramic eggs, even stone eggs. Shoot, you could do plastic eggs with a watercolor ground, and that would still be easier to handle and easier to clean and less salmonella than blowing real eggs. That said, I like how my eggs turned out. I'm proud of these eggs. I don't ever want to do this with eggs again, but I like how it turned out, and I would definitely try this on wood or ceramic. I just can't recommend doing it with real eggs, and I really don't know what possessed me to try, other than my mom was egging me on to create this Eggstravaganza. Emboldened by the semi-success of getting watercolor pigments to stick to eggshells, I decided to try water marbling using the Suminagashi kit. This is the Aitoh Suminagashi kit. I did a chill stream on this a while back, and I thought this would be a fun technique. I've seen water marbled eggs on the internet before, and I figured they were probably using a traditional water marbling kit to actually dye their eggs. Now, this is not a tutorial. This is a what I did, how I failed. Maybe you guys can offer me some alternatives. If you've tried using this kit just straight up with clean water and no oil, no vinegar, and you also failed, then you know probably how I'm doing this wrong. So I'm using blown eggs for this, and that's one of the first problems is they don't want to go in the water. You gotta force them. So I made this like special dipping tool out of paper clips, and I was gonna like spin the egg in the water or slowly submerge it, and I put a kink in it so the egg couldn't just bob up. When you submerge the egg, it takes on a lot of water, and not only that, but I could not get the pigments to actually stick to the egg. I don't know if they're not sitting on the egg long enough. I don't know if there's some additive I need to add, like vinegar or oil to this. I don't know if I should be using dyes rather than pigments because the pigments aren't actually staining the eggs. There's so many ways this could have be done differently that I am just showing you what I did so you guys can make different choices. So I have 2 failed attempts at water marbling here, and I ended up looking it up online to see how other people do it. And I have those links down in the description below if you'd actually like to successfully water marble your own eggs. So Suminagashi.com talks about this. They actually pull from Martha Stewart, and she used food coloring. She used the liquid dye-based food coloring, which I don't have. I asked my mom to pick some up because she was heading over, and she brought the gel-based food coloring because that's all she could find at her local supermarket. She couldn't find the liquid stuff anymore. And while I'm sure we could go to a specialty store and find the pigment stuff or the liquid stuff, or we could order it on Amazon, I like to do these with as much stuff that's commonly available at your local brick and mortar as possible. Also, I just was kind of tapped out with eggs at this point, so I wasn't going to go on a wild goose chase to find some liquid watercolor dyes just so I could Suminagashi some eggs. That might be another video, that might be another time, but that is not today. Now, I do think you could probably use this technique on unglazed ceramic eggs or wooden eggs and have a way better effect. You could probably do this on paper mache eggs as well, and I would definitely be open to revisiting this with wood eggs, ceramic eggs, paper mache eggs in the near future, just for completionist's sake. I want to know. I don't like starting a project and having it fail on me, and I just don't know why. So I do think for real eggs, you can use dye-based food coloring and probably have better effects. In those tutorials, they also talk about adding vinegar to the water and adding oil to the water. And I think that actually thickens up the color a bit and gets it to stick on the egg longer, because I think that's part of the problem. Because with water marbling, you have to rinse it off. And this is after I rinsed it off. And you guys can see, it's like I didn't dye it at all. So now for a palette cleanse, let's have some actual success. I want to use alcohol markers on these blown clean eggs. So these are large white eggs. They've been blown, they've been cleaned, the same process that I've used for watercolor and for Suminagashi. I've also got my washi tape rolls here just to hold my eggs, and I'm using Prismacolor alcohol markers for this, but you can probably use whatever alcohol markers you like. You also probably can do this with water-based markers. I just haven't tried. Now, I apologize, I don't have a drawing tutorial for this part of the video. I'm doing fruits because fruits are seasonal, they're fun, they're refreshing, and they're kind of a palette cleanse, and also they're just something different from flowers. I love flowers, but I also love drawing fruit. So I'm starting out with a lemon. I do have reference pulled up just to double check, particularly for the leaves, and I do find that alcohol inks and alcohol markers are just so much more successful on these eggs than anything else I have tried. So if you're absolutely married to the idea of using blown eggs, alcohol markers are a great way to do it, and they do kind of give you a watercolor effect. They're also not going to have the problems that watercolor has. They're not going to drip. They dry almost immediately. They are way easier to do. They're also faster. You can do details almost immediately because alcohol ink dries fast. Now, if you've ever worked on Yupo, which is a polypropylene plastic paper, this is a lot like working on Yupo. So enter this with your Yupo mindset. It is a little bit easier. It's not as prone to running. You can do layers without it just completely wiping off the past layer, but it's a lot like working on Yupo. And, you know, I gotta be honest, working on real egg is just kind of dumb as a format. I'm ragging on this, mostly ragging on myself for going into it thinking it was gonna be easy. That's the thing with, this year has been such an exploration of crafts I've never done before, techniques I've never tried before, and it's been great. I've learned so much, but I've also made a lot of mistakes, which is wonderful. That's how you learn, that's how you grow. And I've also done a lot of things that, like, I wouldn't necessarily do them again. I don't regret it, but I wouldn't necessarily do it again. So I'm sharing this in case you're watching this and you're like, oh man, she's making it look easy. She's making it look fun. Or you saw the pictures on my Instagram and you're like, oh, those look really cool. I want to do that. You can use many of these same techniques on wooden eggs, on ceramic eggs, and they're going to be easier. They're not going to be as fragile, and you don't have to clean them out, which is the biggest part. So I didn't hate doing this. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I tried it, but I want to take a completely different tack from all the cottagecore, chill, sweet, homemaker vibe blogs. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they often oversimplify things to say that literally any other type of egg format other than real egg is preferable to real egg. Not that I don't like egg, but y'all, they're fragile. You can get salmonella when blowing them. You got to clean the heck out of them. Wooden eggs are just as cheap. The only bonus is we made scrambled eggs, omelets, and French toast with the interiors of these eggs, and you can't do that with a wooden egg. So the orange is super easy. You basically draw a circle and then you add in kind of a speckled dot pattern, leaving it white towards where the light would be hitting the orange. And then for the orange half, that's even easier. Honestly, there's a lot of really simplified fruit drawings that you can take inspiration from. So like with watercolor, you do in general want to allow the first layer to dry. If you don't, you'll get a little bit of a blending effect, but it's mostly that the prior color kind of blows out into, the newly applied color kind of blows out into the first color you put down, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's definitely a your mileage may vary sort of situation. If you're doing teeny tiny faces, you want to let the faces dry before you add the eyes. That's all I'm saying. You also can basically get 2 layers of color with this. Anything more, you're probably going to lose it. It's probably not really going to show up. You also want to work from light to dark for the most part because these are transparent colors and you would just kind of smear the color around if you try to apply a light color on top of your dark color. You probably can blend out by applying a dark color first and then doing your lighter color after. So it's up to you. I know you guys are smart and creative and you're gonna try your own stuff, and I look forward to hearing back from you. In fact, somebody already, they saw my pictures on Instagram and they've already decided to try using acrylic wash on these, and that sounds like a phenomenal idea. That's such a better idea. But I think it is cool that you can use alcohol markers on these. I would not use alcohol markers on hard-boiled eggs that you intend to eat because solvents, you know. But these are blown eggs, so there's not really any reason why you can't. I also recommend a lot of the techniques used from watercolor, keeping it very simple, leaving islands of white, kind of think about it like it's a stencil. These do dry quicker. They kind of look like the watercolor eggs once they're done. They're a little bit shiny. I would not recommend a spray, like a Krylon spray, like a clear coat on these, because that has a tendency to dissolve because they tend to have alcohol in the mist. They will dissolve alcohol inks. But honestly, other than alcohol, other than like rubbing alcohol or denatured alcohol maybe, these shouldn't budge. These shouldn't smear. Alcohol inks tend to be pretty steady and pretty stable and pretty permanent unless you're intentionally trying to clean them off. You can handle these a lot faster because once they've dried, your hands aren't going to pick up the inks and just smear them. So this could be one if you wanted to do it with teenagers or older kids. The alcohol markers could be a more successful way to do it. But I can't reiterate this enough. Like there are better fake eggs. And they're easier to handle and they're less prone to breaking. These things are so fragile because they are eggs. So for the mango, I tried some color into color blending. I applied some yellow and then some orange, kind of blended back out the yellow by blending it into the orange, added some hot pink while everything was still kind of wet so we get a little bit of a soft edge, added some green. It's okay. The mango did not turn out the best. It is my least favorite of the fruit. But I'm glad I tried it. That is my experiences with this whole thing, is like, I've done this. Now I never have to do it again. I feel like it's on every watercolor artist bucket list, like I said before, you know, to do watercolor eggs. I've done them. I can move on. My spirit is now free. This is my attempt at drawing mango leaves. I almost said mango eggs. Mango leaves, because they're long, thin, and kind of sword-like. They did not really read well as leaves. So after applying color to so many eggs, I asked Joseph for a recommendation. What's his favorite fruit? He said mango, so I did a mango. He also suggested kiwi, and the kiwi is actually one of the easiest ones to do. I drew an oval using a really light green ink and kind of filled it in like I would the iris on an eye. And then working from the exterior to the interior using light flicking strokes, I'm using a darker, brighter green. Because if you guys look at kiwis, you'll notice like the center is white and it's got these like white striations throughout the fruit. I let that dry completely. And I did an exterior rim using a lighter brown. You can go back over this with white gouache to do the little kiwi hairs. That would be pretty cute. And then I added in the little tiny seeds using a dark brown marker. I think the kiwi turned out probably the cutest of all. I thought about doing an avocado and I had to stop myself because it's like, oh, you're just using the same techniques and the same colors. And for all the haters out there, tomatoes are fruit. So I decided to draw some tomatoes as well, and they turned out pretty cute. Doing fruit and vegetable eggs on not real eggs would be very, very cute, and maybe a cute kitchen display item. So that's definitely something to think about as I think about my future kitchen as we're looking at houses. Or maybe I am just too twee and I'm wasting my time. I don't know. But I did like the tomato egg. So here are my completed alcohol marker eggs. Of the 3 techniques I tried, these are definitely the best. They're the easiest to do, the least messy, the least frustrating, the quickest to dry, and I think I got the best results with these. And the colors are really, really bright on those white eggs. I did have fun doing this. I know it sounded like I didn't, but I just like to complain, y'all. But I had fun doing it, but I would not do it again on real eggs. I would definitely do it again on fake eggs. So here are all of my beautiful alcohol marker eggs. They are fruits, including the tomato, and I'm pretty pleased with how they turned out, and hopefully I've given you guys some inspiration, maybe not on real eggs, but maybe on the wooden and the ceramic eggs. And here are all of my completed painted eggs, minus the Suminagashi eggs, which just did not turn out this time. So what I want to do is I want to run some cord through the top and the bottom and be able to hang them. That'll give me more display options other than propping them in washi tape rolls and hiding them in an egg carton. We learned how to blow and clean real chicken eggs, which can be a great way if you have a favorite chicken who's laid a particularly pretty egg, or if you've just
got some pretty eggs that you'd like to preserve in some way, or if you're like me and you don't like hard-boiled eggs, that could be a way to dye Easter eggs without wasting those eggs. We also talked about how to watercolor on eggs with mixed results. I showed you guys a few simple springtime florals that you can use your brush to paint onto these eggs, or you can use them in illustration or in design. And I also attempted to do Suminagashi on plain chicken eggs, and also used alcohol markers on plain chicken eggs. So we have done a lot today. Is it worth it? No, not really, no. It's like you do it once, and now you can say you've done it, and we're done. We've done it. We've done the eggs. Cottagecore vibes complete. We've egged. We've done the eggs. We've accomplished the eggs. So, what I think would be a better alternative than blowing your own eggs, because that is very time consuming, it's kind of labor consuming, and then when they break, you just spend all that time and effort on an egg you broke. You can buy wooden eggs, you can buy ceramic eggs, you can buy stone eggs, you can buy so many good dupes. There isn't really a good reason to use real eggs for this unless you just want to use real eggs. They don't take watercolor particularly well. It's like painting on Yupo. They don't take alcohol marker all that better. It's a little bit easier, but it's still like working on Yupo. And they don't take pigment-based Suminagashi. So online I've seen tutorials for using food coloring to do Suminagashi or water marbling techniques on eggs. In fact, Martha Stewart, the queen of crafting, uses dye-based food coloring for that in just kind of a liquid form rather than a gel form. But unfortunately, my mom swung by Winn-Dixie, and all she could find were the gel ones, and I am pretty sure the gel ones will not work super well with real eggs. So that is just a project that I'll have to revisit at a later date, but I am all egged out. I do not think I'll be doing any more art projects with real eggs. Not that they smell bad, it's just they're so finicky. It's such a pain in the butt. The format's weird. It's small. It's fragile. You don't want to get your hands all over it because that will leave like grease-resist fingerprints, even if your hands are clean. It doesn't absorb any of the liquid. Everything just sits on the surface. Once you make a mistake, that mistake is on that egg forever. It's going to stain the egg. You can't just wipe it off. It is a finicky material. When I first envisioned this project, I'd seen beautiful pictures on Instagram. I'd seen lovely aspirational lifestyle vloggers talking about doing it with their children using Crayola watercolors. And I guess I had visions of myself as Beatrice Potter painting little eggs in my little country cottage, but I have access to watercolor paper. I don't have to paint on eggs if I don't want to. So I encourage you to try it once and then give yourself permission to never do it again if you don't want to. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it was helpful, useful, and informative for you guys. I have a friend who's using acrylic gouache on her eggs. I think that's going to give much better results. I think there are ways you could paint real eggs and get nice results. But again, there's so many good dupes out there. Why would you use real eggs when you can use ceramic and wooden eggs? And if you drop them, they're way less likely to break. They're not as fragile. You don't have to be as careful. You don't have to worry as much. And you can probably clean up mistakes. There's just easier alternatives out there. But I still had fun doing it. I feel like I really scratched a big old watercolor crafty to-do off my bucket list. I feel like almost every watercolor artist has painted eggs at some point. So now I have to. Now we are done with that. And we do not have to blow another real chicken egg ever again. Hooray! I have blown so many chicken eggs this year. Alright, so thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a blast sharing it with you. There were some highlights to doing this. It wasn't all bad, and I hope that comes through to you guys. And I'll see you guys again in the near future. If you celebrate Easter, happy Easter. And if you don't celebrate Easter, have a happy spring Sunday anyway. So, I'll see you guys soon. Bye, guys!
Like I said earlier, real egg is kind of dumb as a format. They are difficult to handle, they're small, they're finicky, they're super fragile. So if you want to do this on some decent fake eggs. I did have fun doing it. It was fun to try something new, fun to test out my skills, and fun to try a format I've never tried before, but I would not necessarily recommend it. It looks better than the actual experience is. I would recommend trying this on wooden eggs or ceramic eggs, and I will probably do that and check back in with you guys maybe for next Easter. So if you guys have any suggestions what I did wrong, let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you guys soon.